Good afternoon. I'm Joanne Myers, Director of Public Affairs Programs, and on behalf of the Carnegie Council, I'd like to thank you all for joining us as we welcome this illustrious panel who will shortly be discussing the relevancy of the United Nations. Critics and supporters of the United Nations have sometimes seemed worlds apart. As an organization that represents 191 nations, it is asked both to accommodate the wishes of the most powerful countries while giving a voice and acknowledging the needs of smaller nations. As it struggles to maintain peace in a world where violence and warfare are unfortunately still the norm, we wonder whether it can continue to address the challenges of our world today. To debate this issue, we have gathered together a dream team of panelists, a pundit, a pandit, and a professor to discuss whether in this, the sixth decade of its founding, the UN is still relevant after all these years. Jim Traub, Shashi Tharoor, and Ruth Wedgwood are seated beside me, and they are eager to begin. You will find their bios attached to your guest list. Please join me in giving these exceptionally knowledgeable and gifted speakers a very warm welcome. It is a pleasure to have you all here. Jim.
I am the panda, and when Shashi where are my bamboo shoots? They're
Panda.
All right. So the format of this evening, or so I've been told, is that I kind of referee while the two of them engage in edifying battle for your benefit. So, and I normally try to instruct the people I'm doing this with to not blunt their differences in the interest of politesse, but I don't fear that in this case. So, but I'll count on you to make my job easier by sharpening your own differences. So our subject tonight is UN reform. But I'd like to begin by asking Shashi and Ruth a few questions that have to do with the U.S.-UN relationship, because frankly, everything, or practically everything, winds up turning on this question. And we happen to have a fresh provocation on that subject just over the course of the last week, which I'm sure you've all been avidly following, in which there was a speech by Mark Malloch Brown, the Deputy Secretary General, that criticized
Yes, please turn off your cell phones.
I forgot to say, please turn off your cell phones, BlackBerries, and other, I forget what
wireless
the word
devices.
is. Thank you, other wireless devices. So Mark Malloch Brown, the Deputy Secretary General, gave a quite strikingly sharp speech in which he criticized the United States in terms that are very unusual for a sitting secretariat official. John Bolton took this very personally and fired back, and then Mark Malloch Brown kind of gave a series of responses which just more or less stood his ground. I gather, as of today's Financial Times, which Ruth just showed me a little bit of, the Secretary General has somewhat retracted. But the issues that were raised in the course of this fight are very relevant. So I actually want to begin by asking Shashi if he shares what I understand to be the critique that Mark Malloch Brown was laying out in the course of this speech that he gave, which was essentially that the United States insists on taking maximalist positions when perfectly acceptable compromise positions are available, thus creating an incredibly negative dynamic in the institution where others take maximalist positions. And also that he said that that Washington practices what he called a stealth diplomacy, in which it uses the UN in all sorts of practical ways constantly and has a very solid relationship on 100 different subjects, but refuses to actually talk about it in public so that the public comes away thinking that the UN just means the oil for food scandal and a few spectacular failures, and has no sense of the actual day-to-day relationship between the U.S. and the UN. And more broadly, that the U.S. in recent years has simply failed to consistently commit itself to the success of this institution in a way that is now endangering the institution. So, Shashi, do you agree with that?
Well, I think I let my friend and colleague Mark Malloch Brown speak for himself, and he's done that, I think, very strongly and pertinently. And perhaps one logical consequence of this recent debate is the perception on the part of many of us in the Secretariat that perhaps characterizing member state actions is not the most effective way forward. So let me rephrase, if I might. your approach to all of this. It's not so much a question of how the U.S. conducts itself at the UN, which I think is something for Americans to analyze and sort out for themselves. It's much rather the larger problem of how the United Nations is perceived in this country by this administration and by the broad public. It's always been striking to me that for years, even decades, the UN ran consistently at between 78 and 82% of approval in public opinion polls in this country. The American public, by and large, liked the idea of the UN and liked what they knew about the UN, but the fact that they didn't know very much. It was a kind of support that was a mile wide and an inch deep. And the moment specific sorts of bad news arose, I think it's fair to say that people didn't actually retain that affection for the organization. You all like motherhood and apple pie, and then if you take a bite of the apple pie and don't like the apple, I guess you end up wanting to spit it out. And we've been spat out a few times in recent years, and that's been part of the challenge we've been suffering. And there I would turn to the gatekeepers of public opinion as well. I turn to political leaders. I think practically no congressman or senator actually feels that the United Nations is one of the top half a dozen or top dozen issues on the minds of their constituents, their voters, when they go to their home districts. So it becomes an issue where it really isn't of much political salience to them. And the media, quite frankly, as a general proposition, doesn't really spend a whole lot of time portraying the United Nations. And I say this quite honestly and with some chagrin as somebody whose job it is to try and get the message of the UN out around the world. I don't find it easy to be able myself to appear on mainstream American television or to promote those of my colleagues who have a story to tell in these programs. Yes, we can get on PBS, we can get on CNN International, but much less frequently on CNN Domestic. So if the American public as a whole is blissfully unaware of what the United Nations does that is in America's interests, it's partially because their political leaders and their media gatekeepers, by and large, haven't found this a story worth finding space for.
So Ruth, Shashi has found an artful way of not directly answering the question about the validity of Mark's claims. And I should add, by the way, that in his speech, Mark made it clear that he was not speaking only of the Bush administration. He was saying this was a long-standing problem of the relations between Washington and the institution. So leaving aside the kind of the tactical value or lack thereof of his having said this, do you feel there was any merit in the criticisms that he made?
Well, let me first misuse your question again, since it's your fate as moderator to be misused. Just to note that in today's Financial Times, a piece that is signed by Kofi Annan, who might have been part of the wordsmith team, I don't know. I do think there is a retrenchment from the high rhetoric of Mark Malloch Brown. In the third column right here, it says both sides in the argument over the UN need to turn down their rhetoric and engage in serious negotiations to work out a sensible compromise as a basis for fundamental change later. And I do think that much as I like Mark Malloch Brown, he's a very smart guy. We had spent some time together in Cambridge, Massachusetts at a Harvard conference, and he does give a dandy barn burner speech with no notes. But this time I wish he hadn't used his notes and had let his own sense of the occasion reign, because I do think, as Shashi has intimated, that attacking countries by name, attacking people by designation is not a becoming etiquette and doesn't do anything to try to mend fences. Some people speculate he was trying to earn kudos with the G77 by showing he had a barb for the Americans and therefore would aid the ultimate reform process. That's too Machiavellian for me. I just think that a certain kind of courtesy, which is wanting in Washington often nowadays, is almost prerequisite to hearing the substance of other people's arguments on whether these are new problems or not new problems, obviously. I mean, the problem of getting political consensus on a crisis is as old as the beginning of the Charter in 1948, when the Israeli-Palestinian partition plan was put forward by the General Assembly. It was never adopted by the Security Council in a Chapter 7 resolution, and the Israelis were allowed to fight off the Arab armies by themselves with no UN backing whatsoever. The problem of the withdrawal of peacekeepers in 1973 from Sharm el-Sheikh. I think even when I teach the Congo crisis nowadays, even though we all worship Dag Hammarskjöld, the actual purpose of the intervention is quite murky and evolves as it goes on. So the sense that there is a kind of political confusion is not new. The worry about the efficacy of the machinery is not new.
But Ruth, let me stop you for a second, because I do want to sort of push on this, because I have to say it's my own perception as I've learned more about the UN, I've been surprised how dense is the weave of relations that binds Washington, how indispensable the one is to the other. And so I do want to push on this question. That is it right that, or do you think it's right that there is a widespread perception in this country that the UN is this kind of feckless organization which mostly, gets itself into trouble and does relatively little to advance American interests? And if that's so, is that unfair? And does that in part rest with the unwillingness of policymakers to actually speak truthfully about this nuanced, if incredibly vexed relationship?
Well, if it's feckless, if you Google the phrase Security Council in the New York Times or even the Omaha paper, you discover Security Council pops up at least once or twice or three times a day as you use the council for various crises, whether it's Darfur or Iran, or the wonderful work that's being done on the Harari investigation in Lebanon to try to free Lebanon from Syria's dominance. So it may well be that the readers are less interested in the instrument. I mean, if you ask the same question, does the normal reader of an American newspaper care about the Senate Appropriations Committee? No. They care about the issues that the Senate Appropriations Committee is addressing, whatever instrument is effective. So, and also there's the phenomenon in American media that they love car crashes and train wrecks. So, of course, when there's a scandal, they love it. That's what fills the news hall. But on good news, it's likelier to be the debate over the merits of the solution than the instrument itself.
That's an excellent point, if I may chip in right there, because I think Ruth has put her finger on it. People don't care about the Senate Appropriations Committee. They care about the taxes that the Appropriations Committee the expenditures it's authorizing and so on. But that's precisely because in the U.S. you take the Senate for granted. No one is threatening the existence or the funding of the Senate. No one is essentially concerned about the future of the institution. It's embedded in the Constitution. It's taken for granted. The problem in the UN, in the US, I beg your pardon, is the UN is still up for debate, and that there are still people who challenge the very utility of the institution that is delivering all these goods. And one of the striking things about why the UN was created in the first place is that we had a horrendous first half of the 20th century. I think if you look back at those 45 years where you had 2 world wars, countless civil wars, mass expulsions of populations, genocide, the horrors of the Holocaust and Hiroshima, my gosh, if the century had gone on like that, we wouldn't have really survived to the 21st. And the far-sighted statesmen and stateswomen of the world at the end of the Second World War said, we need to do something to prevent the second half of the 20th century looking like the first half. And so they set up a system. We call it global governance today, but a system of interlocking institutions, rules of the road by which the world could live, and they put the UN as a sort of keystone of this new arch that they had built, this architecture of global governance. And at the heart of it, therefore, lay the idea that in order to keep the peace, in order to help human beings to progress and so on, you needed a mechanism as well as a system of rules that would actually be to the benefit of all. President Truman, when the Charter was adopted, said, it's not about any one country trying to seek advantage. It has to be all, the interests of all. FDR, in fact, in his address to the joint houses of Congress before San Francisco, obviously, since he passed away that spring, FDR said that the UN would be the alternative to all the military alliances, the balance of power politics, the disastrous arrangements that had led to war so often in the past. So you actually lose sight of the fact that the UN exists because of a very real reason. And once it came into existence, it was given a number of tasks, which it has fulfilled. I mean, one of the things that Americans surely haven't allowed themselves to forget is the indispensable role the UN played during the Cold War. It was a vital factor in ensuring the Cold War didn't turn hot. Why? Because it provided a roof under which the two superpower adversaries could meet and engage. Instead of coming to blows, there was actually a place where they could talk and work together. And through the amazing invention of peacekeeping, a concept not even found in the Charter, you had a mechanism to prevent local and regional conflicts from around the world from igniting a superpower clash in a Third World War. So the UN did all of that. Now we've gone past the Cold War phase. We have an opportunity to make much more of a difference. And this globalizing world is full of so many of what we like to call these problems without passports, problems that cross all frontiers uninvited. Everything from terrorism, climate change, human rights, drug trafficking. I mean, you can pick your issue. problems that no one country or even one group of countries, no one coalition, can be rich enough or strong enough or powerful enough to solve on their own. These are by definition problems you need the whole world to come around on, and therefore it's unthinkable that it wouldn't be of use to the US to have a United Nations to deal with all these problems. And day in and day out, the UN does. It's often struck me that, when we had all this focus on the disputes in the UN about Iraq back in 2003, those 8 to 10 weeks leading up to the war, when the UN seemed so bitterly divided, no one noticed that in that same 8 to 10 weeks, the same 15 ambassadors of the same Security Council met and agreed on a dozen different issues unanimously, on Liberia, on Congo, on Afghanistan, on Cote d'Ivoire, the Ivory Coast, and so on, things that were life and death issues for people in those countries. So we just focused on divisions over Iraq. And I think it's important to remember that the UN is indispensable for all that.
So let's focus on a piece of what's all yours there. So especially the last point that Shashi made, that is to say that at the same time as these spectacular failures, the UN transacts a great deal of very important business with the United States that shows a kind of surprising degree of efficacy. Is that fair, or do you think that's overdrawn?
Well, first I want to amuse Shashi and the audience by telling them a vignette about UN history, which I don't think anybody else remembers. I ran into an old Cold Warrior named Tom Farmer in Washington last week, and he recounted for me that at San Francisco in 1945, in the American delegation were two young Navy lieutenants. One was named Richard Nixon.
The other was named John Kennedy.
And the other was named Cord Meyer, who was later with the CIA and the World Federalist Society.
John Kennedy was there as well, right?
So it was quite a smorgasbord of people. I also note for my students, however, that the end of the World War in the Pacific, through the tragedies of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, came 2 months after the meeting in June 45. So the signing of the charter was not the birth of a halcyon world of lamb and lion supping at the same table. Clearly, you have to have a place to talk to folks in a world where my naughty op-ed comes in on competitive multilateralism is that just as corporations, you no longer have to meet at the clock in the middle of the Grand Central Station when you haven't otherwise got instructions, because you can now reach each other on cell phones. So there are no SOP ways of doing things anymore, and you don't necessarily have to have a single venue in which you meet and talk. I mean, OSCE has done terrific work in human rights by hoodwinking the Russians into thinking it was just about security, and guess what? It was also about other baskets. And the European Union, or rather the European Convention on Human Rights, I was quite surprised to discover when I began to spend 9 weeks a year on the UN Human Rights Committee that most of the European states think they have exempted themselves from the petition jurisdiction of the committee by saying that if the European Court of Human Rights has dealt with the issue, ça suffit.
So wait, I want to get out of the long weeds of some of these particulars. Let's go back to something else, which is the whole question of Iraq and what meaning we should ascribe to that. Because this whole reform process began in the fall of 2003, that is to say 4, 5, 6 months after this catastrophic failure to reach an agreement on a resolution to go to war in Iraq. Kofi Annan said, we have reached a fork in the road. That is, the UN is either going to advance and progress and become a relevant institution in this new world or slide back. And he was talking about Iraq, above all, when he said that. So first, I'm curious, what meaning do you ascribe to that failure to reach agreement over Iraq?
Well, the great puzzle is actually why Franklin Roosevelt and Harry Truman supposed that a wartime alliance would endure, and it didn't. It was quite predictable. And I want one more shaggy dog story. There's an interesting diplomatic historian at Tulsa who says FDR and Truman knew exactly what would happen. They simply thought that the moniker of the United Nations and the Council would be sufficient to counter an otherwise quite traditional American isolationism, that in fact the pretense of consensus would be the mechanism you would use to keep America engaged abroad at all.
Well, do a good thing for a bad reason, that's fine.
But clearly, anybody who sits around the building can't ignore the fact that countries vote their national interest, that the organization works on regional groups, that in fact there's a tremendous pressure on members of regional groups to maintain the the discipline of their caucus. It's quite painful for them to break away from the G77 to Quad G7 132 because that's who they have to go for all of their issues. And therefore, this picture of this perfect, if people knew universities, they would never use this metaphor, but this perfect, wonderful academic discourse of what is really Kantian or Habermasian, it doesn't obtain. Energy politics has, obviously roiled the council. If you have a deal with Sudan or a deal with Iran for billions of dollars of energy, you're less likely to vote in favor of intervention. So the real problem has been oftentimes how do you, in fact, craft a consensus? Can you afford to wait that length of time? If you can't get consensus on the ultimate action resolution, is there sufficient consensus before and aft, as you had in Kosovo and Iraq, where the UN diagnosed the problem beforehand and came in afterwards to give legitimacy and a kind of emerging legality to the use of force? But I don't think you can ever survive in the institution without a kind of Machiavellian political virtue. If you go in naively and thinking that invoking world federalism or universalism is going to get you what you need,
but Ruth, that's a hyperbolic explanation. Is the fact? I mean, obviously, this was a unique level of catastrophe. This train wreck of the failed resolution on Iraq. And so is your point that it's naive to expect that a thing that is as divisive as that actually could be resolved by the mechanism of the Security Council, and therefore such disagreements are inevitable and rooted in the institution?
No, I think UNSCOM, the UN Weapons Monitoring Commission headed by Ralph Akey, has worked quite well up through 1995. Then Saddam began to detect the splits politically in the Council with the Russians and the French, and he exploited them, craftily and subtly. And from 95 onward, it was very hard sailing. And would the dramaturgy of an intervention have been better if it occurred in 98 than 03? You betcha. But it didn't. I do think that one can make a multilateral argument for the intervention in the sense that the force of the mandate of the Council was being quite openly disregarded by Saddam, and that the credibility of future mandates might in part depend upon that. I mean, prudence and legality are different issues. But I don't think one should see it as a unilateral act because the Council beforehand had said over and over and over again that Saddam was in flagrant breach of Resolution 687.
Shashi, certainly the view inside the institution, which I know the Secretary General shared and many people shared, was that the Washington had put the institution in an impossible position and essentially pushed it beyond the limits whereby it could function and did provoke a structural crisis, which thus the wish for a sense of a fork in the road. Do you share that view, or are you going to allow yourself to say whether or not you share that view?
Well, I'll tell you what did happen, because in fact, in the summer of 2003, just after the war, the Pew organization, a respected organization, conducted a poll in 20 countries around the world about the UN. They discovered the UN's image had gone down in all 20. It had gone down in the US because the UN had not supported the US administration on the war, and it went down in the 19 other countries because the UN had been unable to prevent the war. So you see, we got hit from both sides of the debate. We disappointed both sets of expectations. So you want to describe that as an impossible position for the institution to be in? Sure, it was pretty impossible. But then, as Yogi Berra said, when you come to a fork in the road, take it. And we took it, right?
That was another diplomatic dodge there, Shashi. So should I infer that these are directions I just shouldn't push you in too far because it would be foolish for you to
look
hazard an
forward.
opinion?
I mean, the topic that we've advertised here is what? The United Nations still relevant after all these years? I think so. But I remember in 2003 when we had giving a dozen interviews a
Cole
day
Porter song.
to the world leader, to the world media. You can sing it, Ruth, I'm sure. I remember a BBC interviewer sort of at one point saying to me, so how does the UN feel about being the I word, irrelevant? And he was about to go on when I interrupted him and said, I think the I word for us is actually indispensable. And I wasn't just trying to score a debating point, because in fact, I think it's clear that, as in many occasions, the UN is often irrelevant to a decision about war. In fact, the UN has really only been involved in about 2.5 decisions to authorize war in its entire 61 years of existence. But it's extremely relevant to the ensuing peace and to all sorts of other disastrous and important situations around the world other than war. I mean, right now, for example, we've had our hands full with disaster after disaster In Asia, we've had to deal with the tsunami and its aftermath, the earthquake in Kashmir, most recently the Indonesian earthquake, and then the volcano eruption. These are the sorts of things for which competitive multilateralism or no, Ruth, there is simply no competition for the UN. And there's, again, one very sound reason where the universality of the UN becomes so relevant here. No one government likes to pay second fiddle to any other. I mean, lots of governments are giving aid and assistance, but no one wants to do it under the umbrella of another government. But when the UN goes in there and the blue flag is flying, it means the whole world is taking charge. It means that humanity is responsible, not one government. And in that process, the universality of the United Nations gives you a mechanism to actually deliver effective results.
There's a reason why the founding fathers in Philadelphia rejected the idea of a collective executive. They thought that it would be very hard to actually ever take a decision if you had to get a huge number of people to. So it depends in part whether you think inactivity is a better state of existence than activity.
I don't think there's been much inactivity in all these humanitarian disasters.
There are occasions when one has to move forward. I mean, I will concede the relevance, stipulated, relevant. Monopoly, no, because indeed the very premise of the collective security system broke down in the first years. Again, the UN can't legally require, at least it chooses not to legally require, that any country in fact donate troops. So if you're a country...
This is a straw man. No one is claiming monopoly. The UN has never said it's the only answer to the world's problems.
Well,
It said it's the only answer to those problems that affect the whole world, which is different. I mean, you do have regional situations in which, of course, there are regional actors, and my gosh, the Security Council was only too glad to let ECOWAS initially handle Liberia and Sierra Leone until the UN had to step in, or to let the CIS go in.
Move this in a slightly different direction, because Ruth, you made the point that the premise broke down in the initial years. That is to say that these five powers could collectively police the world because they had a collective interest.
This was supposed to be a worldwide NATO, yes.
So a worldwide NATO, that's right. I mean, created more or less at the same time. So just...
No, created earlier than NATO. The UN was the original treaty organization.
Anyway,
it was when the Cold War started.
Approximately. Let me just try to move forward here, okay? So then clearly that proves to be false because the Cold War line went straight down the middle of the Security Council. The Cold War ends. Then there's the hope that now finally the dream of 1945 can be realized. Now, is what we're seeing now in part a actual recreation of the Cold War division of the Security Council, where actually in most cases you have Russia and China on one side of a whole range of issues, and the US, the UK, and France on the other side, such that you have a kind of new version of that old paralysis?
Well, it's sort of a fractal Cold War with lots of different factions. Where the French will be, you have to predict, and the Germans, obviously, if they become permanent members of the Council, might be quite at odds with us on the need to intervene in various situations. One of the unspoken, if I may, one of the unspoken themes in Security Council expansion, which nobody really dares openly address, is that if you expand the Council with a great many countries that don't feel themselves to be the intervenor, but the intervenee, you may actually make it harder for the Council to do the very kind of anti-genocidal, anti-civil conflict intervention that is really its bread and butter nowadays. Countries will vote their worldview along with their national interest, and countries just have often different views. The other thing I worry about in the relevance versus monopoly debate is just the moral hazard problem. I mean, if you tout the UN in a naive fashion to build up its prestige with the American people, whatever. My worry is that it creates the belief that the UN will, in fact, be there to act effectively in every crisis. And there are problems which often unpredictably it can't do because of political fracture. So you can get a kind of moral hazard where a leader like Izetbegovic supposes that the West will intervene with jackboots and bludgeons to kick the Serbs out and the Serb army out, and guess what? It didn't happen. You can actually encourage reckless behavior by national leaders if they take for granted this premise of the automatic, frictionless, perpetual motion UN machine. So it's a very dangerous trope.
Another straw man, and no one's suggesting that's the case. I mean, I've just been through this very interesting exchange in the New York Times letters pages not too long ago, when after a rather idealistic column deploring the UN's failure to sort of solve Darfur, I wrote in saying that, the things that the world was prepared to do about Darfur were first humanitarian aid, sending in humanitarian workers, both in Darfur and across the border in Chad. Second, trying to do the very best we could of boots on the ground, in this case African Union boots on the ground, because that's all the government was prepared to accept. But where these African Union soldiers were deployed, their presence did make a difference. But there's 7,000 of them in a country the size of Texas. And then third, of course, was pressure on all sides to come to a peace agreement in Abuja to end the conflict so that then a peace could be kept. And then, of course, a UN peacekeeping force could go in. And I said, this is really what we were trying to do, and now the pressure must be on the government of Sudan, above all, to accept a robust UN peacekeeping force and to let an assessment team go in so we could plan for such a force. And there was a very nice but anguished letter from a rabbi the next day or 2 days later saying, but if the UN isn't able to impose itself on Darfur, then the UN has failed, or the UN is disappointed.
Well, Shashi, I think many people, I don't think it's only this anguished rabbi who might feel that way.
But that's exactly the point I'm making, is in response to Ruth's about expectation.
Well, but then let me ask it in this way, and let me ask Ruth this question. Well, two things. One, should we say that the Security Council's behavior in regard to Darfur, should we call that a failure? Because it seems to me Shashi is saying in part it's only by the standard of unreasonable expectations.
No, but wait a minute. It's not just the UN. The point I'm trying to say is there any, if the UN didn't exist tomorrow,
that was part two of my question to Ruth.
Is there any country on earth that's actually prepared to go to war to impose a peace?
You may answer both or either of those questions.
There isn't. We have to make do with the best we can.
Rhetoric actually matters, and when you talk about the world or mankind or humanity, it sounds so much more efficacious than when you talk about a collection of member states that have very different agendas. And actually, since I've known Shashi for a good long time, whenever something goes bad, don't forget we're only a collection of member states. When something goes well, it's mankind speaking. And you got to watch him because he has a rhetorical fork in his road, much as I love him.
And you have a fork in your tongue, my dear.
See, I told you it wouldn't require any encouragement from me. Yes, continue.
But therefore, I mean, the great tragedy is that there is, if you will, a kind of limit of a surprisingly modest limitation on usable democratic military power in the world. One of the great tragedies of Europe's demilitarization, though they still seem to think they need it to not go to war amongst themselves. But they can't project power. They have a very limited ability to deploy ready reaction forces. We're still waiting for the 50,000 corps that the European Union is supposed to have. They've all had bad peacekeeping experiences. One of my anti-Holbrookian reasons for expanding NATO was that every Western European country has already had a bad experience in peacekeeping, whether it's Srebrenica or the Belgians in Rwanda. And I wanted some sort of virginal.
So give them a chance to have bad experiences with NATO as well.
Once more for the Gipper. Romania,
but so to go back
Bulgaria.
to Darfur, let's say that
so the problem
yes.
there is the absence of countries willing to put themselves in the middle of a very difficult conflict where the Janjaweed are utterly just bloody-minded and morally feckless and
so it's not the
indiscriminate.
UN's fault, it's that no country
and on the other side, some of the rebel groups won't at the moment compromise. So it's a very difficult peacekeeping situation, and very few countries are willing to risk the actual deaths.
So no different
of
architecture. There's no reform that would make the UN a more effective instrument when it comes to these kinds of atrocities.
No, the UN has to go around with its begging bowl, just as everybody else does, to try to put together a coalition force.
That's right.
And one should not have any over-expectation of the willingness of democracies to put their troops at hazard, and particularly in areas where the kind of war you're fighting is so difficult to game.
Okay, so let's now that we've sort of begun to verge on the reform question, are we running out of time here, Joanne?
About 5 more minutes.
Oh,
I
haven't even done reform.
Okay, let's talk about some of these reforms. The Human Rights Council has now come into existence. The United States chose not to join it because it felt this is not what we had in mind. Ruth, do you think that was the right decision? And could there have been a much more effective Human Rights Council that, alas, did not come into being?
Well, my fear, which I hope will not be realized, is that the same folks what brought you the Human Rights Commission are going to bring you the Human Rights Council. I mean, the pressures on countries to conform in their voting behavior are still there. If there's one thing I would change at the UN, and I don't know how to do it, if Shashi becomes Secretary General, he can change it by decree.
Are you writing this down, Shashi?
Your
Your to-do list?
But again, the inner discipline of the regional groups is so great that concessions you can get in capital-to-capital bilateral conversations fall by the wayside and pick your group, any group, but I will, for the sake of argument, say the G77, which is the G132, which is 2/3 of the GA, which is the voting majority you need for any important decision. If they take a position, it's a very brave member that would fall away. And to that degree, I worry that the capacity to really have conversations on the merits about what you need. Now, Human Rights Council, we all know all the arguments on both sides. One hopes it will not have a singular permanent agenda item on Israel. One hopes that Israel will finally get into WEOG, which I think Jan Eliasson had hoped to.
Explain, that's the European group.
The Western
of
European and other groups.
Be careful with the shorthand. We have some lay people here.
Yes, you have to live in the culture. But you can't do nothing if you're not a member of a regional group. And the Western European and Others group, which is the sort of Commonwealth group, Australians, New Zealanders, Canadians, Americans, and Turks are allowed in too, but not Israel.
But
so Israel has no capacity to function in the Human Rights Council. Jan Eliasson, the president of the GA, had hoped to change that as part of this negotiation. He didn't succeed. So I'll wait and see. I have a optimistic hope that it will not be as bad as people suppose. But the same pressures that brought you the original commission, over time, I fear, will degrade the council.
Shashi, you could argue that here's an institution whose Security Council can't find a way of even putting Zimbabwe on its agenda to even talk about it. Why would you expect that this same institution is going to create a different organ, the Human Rights Council,
I'll tell you
in
what,
which they will act effectively?
They actually have done so, because one of the fundamental reasons why I would disagree with Ruth's point about it being just like the Commission is that whereas in the Commission, which had become an over-politicized body, you had a lot of sort of bizarre merchant business going on where countries got themselves elected to the Commission to prevent scrutiny of their human rights records, because they would indeed vote, saying, I'll vote to prevent your human rights being examined if you vote to prevent my human rights violations.
So why can't they do that now?
They can't do that now because the founding document, the General Assembly resolution creating the Council, explicitly mandates a universal peer review. So every country on the Council, the day they're elected, guarantees that their human rights records will be examined.
Assuming that the peer review is so scathing that Cuba is going to be forced to leave the Human Rights Council?
We'll see how honestly they conduct it. Obviously, the proof of the pudding is always in the eating, but we actually have a recipe that can work.
So let's, since we're running out of time, yes, you'll have a chance. What's that?
I said time flies when you're having so much
Yes,
fun.
okay. Now, the huge obstacle that the institution is facing now, which could be leading to quite the train wreck, is this question of management reform, because the White House has said that if the UN can't prove that it can run itself effectively, then we're going to use the budget as a lever to force it to do so. I guess the question is, and I believe, Ruth, you may have kind of written this in a piece you wrote in the National Interest, is the culture,
that was my very naughty piece.
is this an insoluble problem? Because most of the members actually are perfectly happy to have an ineffective UN, because an effective UN isn't so important to them, and other things are important to them.
Well, I think Kofi Annan has rightly said to the membership at large that it's crazy. The stuff we're doing is largely to help you guys. And whether it's the disease, I mean, here I'm going to sound like Shashi Tharoor.
Thank you, Ruth.
The thing, most of what the UN does, apart from security crises, are things that are aimed at helping the less developed countries. And not wasting money, having procurement that actually purchases goods at a market price, not having sinecures where people sleep. When I take my kids around, I have a lot of students at Johns Hopkins who want to join the UN. And I think the best way for them to see it is in the field operations. I won't quote the former official from the personnel department who said, when I asked, why is there such an early retirement age at the UN, the person said, well, how else would we get rid of them? This person's point was that the way that people are recruited into the main secretariat is so random. I tell my kids they have to watch the UN website. You can't even put a Google alert. You have to watch the UN website to hope that your country comes up in your specialty as underrepresented before you turn 32. So if Albert Einstein applies in physics, but they have too many German Jews or Germans or Jews, at that point, too bad. And that's great. You want people mid-career who can come in and come out. You want the Secretary General, here I'm right on board, to be able to redeploy people to urgent missions, to be able to reprogram money, and to have to be micromanaged at this level of detail. I take it as proof somehow that some members don't just worry that the SG will be subject to superpower domination. They don't trust the SG himself. And that's a terrible testament to, I think, a kind of distrust of a different kind within the organization.
Shashi, what do you think about
I
that?
think we can rise above this, and I do believe this is a problem on the way to a solution. But I want you to look back a little bit. I mean, I've actually on the 1st of May celebrated the 28th anniversary of my having joined the United Nations system. I began with the UN High Commissioner for Refugees. And if on the day I joined, I'd said to my seniors that I was joining an organization that I expected would one day run elections in sovereign states, that would one day send intrusive inspectors to conduct inspections for weapons of mass destruction, that would one day impose sanctions on the entire import-export trade of a medium-sized member state, that would one day send human rights monitors to see how a monarch was treating his own people, that would one day set up an international criminal tribunal to try former heads of state for crimes against their own people, but under international law, that would one day run entire territories, and so on and so forth. These people, my seniors, would have looked at me and said, this was the late 70s, they would have said, young man, what are you smoking? The fact is, they would not have said to me that I understood the UN that I was trying to join. And yet in the career span of this one official, the UN has done all these things and more. And I believe the transformation has come because the UN has proved itself to be an organization that is capable of adapting with sufficient flexibility to the changes in the
But that's dodging the question, because those are issues of intrusion, and clearly legally the Charter has evolved to a much greater sense that it can look at human rights, which is some of its best work, that it can look at democratic governance. We're quite far from the moment of the agenda for democracy when I used to get calls from the 38th floor.
We set up a democracy fund just in September.
For the 38th floors, doubting whether democracy was a universal norm. But let me give you an example from my Human Rights Committee, which is, I call it my pajama party. I spend 9 weeks a year unpaid doing it, living on my little stipend in Geneva in New York. And I think it does good work because it engages with countries around the world that otherwise would fall beneath the bilateral political radar. Suriname, who would care in strategic politics? But you do get some conversation. If we put it on the radio, it'll have a huge effect on civic society or on the web. But also in terms of efficiency, just think about small factoids that aren't shared with the public. Our work costs $10,000 an hour to convene with note-takers, translators. If we take a 15-minute coffee break, that's $2,500 that could have gone for HIV, AIDS, retroviral vaccine. Our pages cost $1,600 to produce. So if we do a 37-page opinion, when an Austrian zoning lawyer writes to the UN Human Rights Committee demanding his claim under the General Right of Equality, Article 26, we have wasted $50,000 that could have gone to a better use. So some sense of money versus product is essential.
So let me stop because I think we want to turn it over to the audience. So just one last thing. We've had this reform process now. It's obviously has some ways more to go. But just briefly, I'd like each of you to say whether this reform process, whether we should feel, as a result of all this, that yes, this institution is capable of adaptation and things are moving in a positive direction, or no, the real meaning is the limits of what it can do when things are not moving in a positive direction. Just a couple sentences from each of you on that, and then we'll turn it over to the audience.
Sure. Well,
Shashi?
To some degree, I've answered that question, so yes. I won't take away more time from the audience. But let me add that, 50 years ago when the UN was being criticized, Dag Hammarskjöld put it perfectly when he said the UN was not created to take mankind to paradise, but to save humanity from hell. Sometimes we can prevent
in a cost-efficient way.
That writer, I think, hadn't entirely escaped him. But the point I think that's important to note is that the United Nations has adapted, can adapt, must adapt. But at the same time, it remains this one indispensable global institution in this globalizing world of ours. It's the one place where we can get every country together, not frankly, to give up any shard of their sovereignty, they won't, but to leverage their sovereignty collectively for the common goals, the common purposes that all countries agree upon.
So, Ruth, a couple sentences on your part.
First, Shashi said can, must. He didn't say will. So this was a cautious statement. If I were SG, unlikely as that would be, what I would do differently, I think, is to say, look, that the oversight of national parliaments, this very active conversation, which has been wished for from the days of the moderate reservationists, the mild reservationists on the League, and now is wished for Democrat and Republican alike in Congress. This can actually help me. This is Lyndon Johnson's desire for a street demonstration to help him pass legislation. What the UN doesn't get now, there used to be a slogan, I'll be quick, no one's married in Bosnia. I won't go in fully unraveling that. But the temptations of hyperspace, of being international, of representing the world and humanity and the future of mankind, does lead to a sense of immunity. The normal transparency you expect in government, an FOIA premise that everything will become public eventually, allowing national parliaments to see how their money is used, having disclosure forums on conflicts of interest that are available to the public on the web as opposed to only member missions, would all be to the good. And then, if you want to engage the public, treat them like adults. And in a democracy, voters expect to have a great deal of information about what their delegates and agents do, not just what you put out in a public information campaign, but to be able to scrutinize and critique. It's why God invented the GAO, and the Congressional Budget Office, and IGs in every department of the U.S. government. And it's a lesson I think the UN still hasn't taken. They seem to suppose too often that transparency is the enemy, that this has to be controlled, that what will the children think?
So let me stop you there.
I'd like to thank you, Jim, Ruth, and Shashi. I think we've all benefited from your banter and discussion. Now I'd like to open up the floor to discussion, and you just please wait until the microphone comes to you.
First of all, just a quick point that one of the themes in a number of the writing on the UN is to distinguish between the UN as a forum and the UN as an actor. And I do think that a lot of the criticism of the UN is when it's only a forum. In other words, the Security Council not being able to agree on Iraq had to do with member states. So I think much of it falls on the member states, the shortcomings, including the United States, which is not prepared to send any troops anywhere in Africa, just to take the Darfur example. So I don't think it can just all be laid on the UN Secretariat or the Secretary General. But I did want to come back to the very first point you made about being the media and the politicians in the United States who were not doing enough to promote an understanding of the UN. You know, I was at the U.S. mission already in the Carter years, and I always felt there was something very hermetic about the UN system. And there was what I used to call a glass wall down First Avenue. The people were very sort of generally satisfied with themselves inside the Secretariat, and that there was very little outreach to the Congress, and that it was this kind of once-a-year meeting between the President and the Secretary General, and that seemed to do it. I wonder, since you've been there the 28 years, whether you do feel that not only yourself personally, but the senior membership really does have enough of an outreach, or whether it could do much more than it is doing. I do think that Fox News and all these people put out a terrible impression, and a misjudged impression, misinformed impression. But I do think there's much more the Secretariat could perhaps do above and beyond this particular speech that Mark made the other day. So I wondered if you wanted to comment on that.
Sure. Well, first, as you mentioned Congress, and yes, we do much more with Congress than we ever used to. Nowadays, not only do we have frequent visits from New York down to Congress to talk to Congress people and their staffers, but whenever we have people coming in from the field, whether it's the head of the UNRWA who was here recently or one of the peacekeeping operations, we do send them out to Washington too, because of course the US is the biggest paymaster, and these folks in Congress are the ones who need to understand what the missions are accomplishing or not, ask the questions, get satisfactory answers so they can vote the necessary funds. And that's become a key part of our work relationship with the U.S. administration. It's not just administration, it's Congress as well. On the larger public, I mean, I would say that we are always available and all too willing to go on every available medium to speak to the American public. Just last week, we've had a whole bunch of talk show radio hosts up at the UN doing live dispatches from there. We will accept any invitation to put ourselves on to get word out. That doesn't necessarily mean that we'll always have a chance to say what we want to say, or that we won't be outshouted by other voices. But that's part of the risk we'd be prepared to take. But as a general proposition, we do find it much easier to be heard or to get a hearing elsewhere in the world than in the US, and we'd certainly love to see that change, which is not a criticism of the American people, who I genuinely believe, I mean, whenever I meet people and talk to them, there's a lot of interest and a lot of sympathy, but it's more a question of media judgment as well as to what the gatekeepers think will be of interest to their publics. Final thought about whether we can do an effective job putting this message across. There's an old Indian proverb that says, you can't wake a man who is pretending to sleep. If you think about that for a minute, if there's some people who don't want to hear you, they will not hear you.
But if I could just sashay on to John's question, I do think there still is some inner, Shashi's too sophisticated for this, but still some inner belief inside the building that you can control information, that what is wanted is delivery of information, instead of a very porous blogosphere, omnivorous desire for actual statistics and facts. I mean, again, the pay scale at the UN is classified. What does an ASG or a USG or a P5 or P3 make? How many women are there in P5s, D2s? All of this is an inner culture where you have to have a building pass and take people to lunch.
We're quite willing to make that public, Ruth, anytime. No, I mean it. I mean,
no, but seriously, the premise that everything should be public unless there's a really good reason not. And there ought to be an FOIA, which after 25 years or 40 years, with omissions for personalities and sensitive confidential assurances given, allows even the inner diplomacy of the UN to be available, it's just as every democracy ought to make its own diplomatic history available. There's a premise that this is our business. You should trust us.
Let's move on. And
it came up, someone asked, what about better PR? Well, I was just thought at that time to myself that one form of PR could be statesman-like addressing of all the issues that were brought up today, the complexity of it, were in a paper like the Times, where people could hear not one side, but what was addressed today here at the Carnegie Council. And that might be one way to add to helping the process, and I just wanted to throw that out.
thank you.
I think you'd have to persuade the editors of the Times. We'd certainly be game to play along with it.
In the interest of full disclosure, I work for UNDP as an outreach and communications advisor. I'm on the other side of the street, but my question doesn't go to defending the existence of the UN, but to ask the question, what would happen in this borderless world of ours, where borders have become so porous, and things not like drugs, human trafficking, bird flu, environmental disasters don't recognize nation-state boundaries in the way they did 50 years ago when the UN was formed. Since the UN was formed, so many more countries have come to independence. And so is it a problem of just an outdated organization that needs modernization and updating? Or if we're to get rid of the UN, who's going to deal with all these cross-boundary problems that we have other than war?
If I could just jump in on that. I mean, there are lots of different forms of coordination. There's a kind of horizontal coordination. One method used in, indeed, drugs and other kinds of crimes is to have a treaty body in which, or treaty framework in which nation states are required to create a category of crime and to repress it. And you're not running all the operations through the eye of a single needle. You're simply recognizing a mutual obligation to take precautionary action against a problem of the commons. So it doesn't have to be run from New York in the sense that you have a czar who's telling nation states exactly what to do. They can undertake mutual promises to each other without necessarily having it be czared by a particular person. I mean, I do think having someone like Peter Piot in HIV/AIDS is hugely important to persuade heads of state that they ought to admit that they have a sex trade problem and that they have a high degree of incidence, and it's not a shame, it's an opportunity to help people. And that kind of bully pulpit pulpiting can be very useful. Where I think the UN often gets into trouble is in the kind of random shots, and this is closer to home, forgive me, it takes in various crises. I'm just amazed. One of the interesting features of learning how the 38th floor works is that statements aren't vetted. So you'll have different characterizations of who did what to whom in the Middle East, coming from different actors who are out on holiday at various conferences around the world. Is it an unlawful occupation or just an occupation? And those kinds of freighted words, which are not the problem with the commons, these are particular security crises, are often alienate communities in the most profound ways in an untutored, unstudied, random kind of drive-by shootings with words that I think the UN needs to get much more clearly under control. There needs to be a process on the 38th floor which understands that words also are weapons, and that I think would conserve the political capital and prestige of the Secretary General in a much more
Ruth, if I could ask, in your kind of ideal world, because you would get rid of some things that the UN has a monopoly on, like what stuff should the UN not be doing that it is doing now, or should be doing much less of that it is doing now?
I think development, one profound change over the decades has been the movement of development toward the bank and the fund. Again, I was surprised when I was researching Jesse Helms's critique of the budget back in '96. I was surprised to learn that about 3/4 of the budget goes for things that aren't security in a narrow military sense, or Security Council, or Department of Political Affairs, or the SG's function. It goes for various kinds of economic commissions, social commissions, sustainable development, and developmental sustainability. And the question of possible redundancy in those jobs is very much at issue. I understand that at times countries that don't qualify for commercial capital have felt they need a way to get access to capital that's effective for their purpose. But that's where, indeed, the World Bank itself has come in, and shopping projects to the bank. So much of the old Secretariat development function has, I think, necessarily gone to the Bretton Woods institutions. And if you're looking for redundant mandates, you could shut down a few there.
Not entirely, no. I'm going to have to do more of that. I think the important point here is that for developing countries to have a forum in which they actually have a voice, where they have the one country, one vote situation in the General Assembly, to be able to articulate, if you like, their political views on development issues is extremely important.
That doesn't require 3/4 of the budget.
No. Well, you have 5 regional commissions in 5 different parts of the world that are actually doing a lot of the economic and social work. There's norm building that's done at the UN. We certainly do not have a significant portion of the money that goes into development. Even the Bretton Woods institutions, which are, of course, the key players financially, and the World Trade Organization, which we haven't even mentioned, which is technically outside the UN system. In addition to that, there's now the private sector, which is playing a big part. Now, I don't think the UN is trying to compete with any of those, but the UN has its own special place in this issue, and certainly the G77 you mentioned so much today would not be happy to hear you suggest that this should be shut down.
I didn't say shut down, I said rationalized. Because, again, what one wishes for is the delivery of development capital to countries in a way that helps them. And even, dare I say, in the debate on the Millennium Challenge Goals, or the 0.7 ODA.
Goals. Yeah, Millennium Development Goals.
Excuse me. Challenges the American part, pardon me. When you talk to people who've worked in the bank, say in Chad, say in Cameroon, say in many countries, say in Italy, you have to worry about how money reaches the ground in a fashion that helps people. And one of the concerns that a great many development people have is that simply shoveling money out the door can make kleptocracy worse, not better. You could have a multilateral tulip effect, if you will, not simply an oil tulip effect.
Right. We'll take one last question.
As I was listening to Ruth's analogy of the UN to the pristine and fertile conditions of an academic institution, and how inapposite the analogy is, as the progeny of professors, I learned early on that academic stakes are so vicious. Academic politics are so vicious because the stakes are so small. And at the UN, the stakes are huge, and yet the politics sometimes don't seem vicious enough. So as you look at this extreme spectrum between irrelevance and indispensability, as you try to stake out the right point on that spectrum, what's the role of introspection? and real serious introspection when you sort of analyze your own 28-year career and what preceded you and where you are going forward. How do the remedial measures to date make the place more effective? But more importantly, we wouldn't have sort of entertained this debate had there not been a point of view that is, I wouldn't say hostile, but skeptical of whether or not the UN has achieved what it could achieve in a cost-effective way. And one example, I mean this is a general question, but one specific point that Ruth raised, she didn't really posit it as a question, but certainly taught us lay people a new acronym. When you have the marginalization of a country like Israel, and without talking about specific resolutions, you've got a marginalization here that is a byproduct of the internal bureaucracy of WEOG, and yes, you can be included or you can't be included, and there's a certain mandate or jurisdiction that falls to some of the regional groups. Is there an entity, whether it's a task force or a think tank or some other group within the United Nations that looks at these and looks at these infirmities, if you will, and thinks about enabling member states to really have a fair voice?
Is this directed to Shashi?
It is, yes.
I'll answer it too.
I'm sure we can both answer it. I mean, it was an excellent question. I enjoyed your point about politics. I mean, the fact is that on the Israel situation, you're not talking about something, frankly, that has anything to do with bureaucracy, your phrase, but rather to do with politics amongst member states. Because admission into regional groups is something that member states alone can decide who gets into their group. It so happens that Israel belongs to WEOG in New York, but has not been given full admission in Geneva. That was what Ruth was referring to in the context of human rights. But Israel, I'm pleased to say, is a vice president of the General Assembly and is not, in that sense, a marginalized state at the General Assembly in New York. But certainly, participation in a regional group is a passport to election to office, election to various councils and committees and so on. And that's something that the Secretary General and others have pushed for, that should happen for Israel in Geneva and everywhere else. But on the broader question of introspection, which I thought was a very interesting one, sure, we have lots of task forces, working groups, committees. My gosh, the open-ended working group that was studying Security Council reform is now universally dubbed the never-ending working group, because it's been discussing the issue for so long without a concrete solution. And in fact, it's a very good example, Security Council reform, of a problem where it's like sort of doctors gathering around a patient and they all agree on the diagnosis, but they can't agree on the prescription. So introspection goes on, action doesn't follow in that particular instance. But introspection ultimately is an individual quality. And I think one can say that the capacity for introspection of a Secretary General like Dag Hammarskjöld or Kofi Annan has a great deal of value in and of itself. I mean, Kofi Annan's speech on intervention to the General Assembly in 1999 is a striking example of how one person's introspection essentially helped change the world agenda on this issue. Resulted in many ways, 1,000 flowers blooming at think tanks around the world, and also then led directly to the evolution of what is now called the norm of the responsibility to protect, which has been enshrined in the summit declaration of the World Summit last September, the notion that sovereignty carries with it the responsibility to protect your own citizens, but if you're unable or unwilling to exercise that responsibility, the international community has to think of doing so. Now that's a whole new idea, and it's emerged from a process of, to use your word, introspection. So I believe introspection does have a place in the international system. But that doesn't always immediately lead to action. Because action in all these things requires a combination of resources, of political will, and that political will is something which member states, governments have to find for themselves. The UN, for going back to the Darfur thing, we have no standing army we can send off to a place like Darfur. For any intervention, you need a collective decision by member states in the Security Council. You then need countries willing to give you the troops, the materiel, the money to make it work. And then you can make a difference. So there are these various stages and processes. Sometimes it will seem inadequate. And I can understand the impatience of people around the world who see horrors on their television screens and want to see them end. We all want to see them end. But the fact is, the United Nations is a mirror of the world. It reflects both our disagreements, the feebleness of our collective political will, as well as our hopes, our aspirations, and sometimes indeed our effective determination to deliver results. So I just want to again go back to an old metaphor of Dag Hammarskjöld's when the UN was criticized in the 50s, when he said it's rather like the Santa Maria, sailing off across uncharted waters to new lands, beset by stormy weather, and there are people on shore blaming the problems on the ship rather than on the weather. And this is something that you have to understand. We operate in an environment. We operate within the global climate. We operate within what governments will allow us to do.
If I may, just a couple of quick aphorisms. One is you can make your own weather to some degree, and how the UN conducts itself and what it says, especially from the 38th floor, can affect the tenor of the rest of the conversation. I am a big fan of Kofi's 1999 speech on sovereignty and intervention. The ellipsis in that speech when it said, if you had Rwanda to do over again and the Security Council wouldn't vote a resolution, but several other countries would come in to stop the genocide, what should you do, ... And he doesn't say what, but it certainly admits as a conceivable legitimate choice an ad hoc intervention. So I think Kofi should be given actually credit for inventing competitive multilateralism, and I cede my copyright. But I also want to say a word for extrospection, which is that a lot of the current debate about the legitimacy of the methods of reform has been, is it a mortal sin or a venal sin to threaten to withhold your dues for some period of time if you think that something needs changing. And I will now resort to the blogosphere. Miss Suzanne Nozol, who was a charming and smart gal who used to work for the number 5 in the U.S. mission under Bill Clinton, a Harvard Law School graduate, and she has a great blog called Democracy Arsenal. And when Mark Malloch Brown was giving his speech, she had a very funny, you'll have to forgive me, 10 seconds, funny passage. He's just blogging as he's speaking. And Suzanne says, he's acknowledging that the group of 77 developing countries have opposed vital reforms to... Yup, he just did. And then she goes on, he's calling for no more take it or leave it demands by the U.S., yet often take it or leave it is all that works. My daddy was a labor negotiator for 35 years, and I will just recount that, if you look at UN history, the gentleman's agreement in the mid-'80s that budgets should be by consensus, the creation of the IG in the mid-'90s, the budget deal done by Holbrooke with 22% for U.S. in the late 90s, were all done by take-it-or-leave-it propositions. It's a bargaining technique, ladies and gentlemen. It's not a rejection of world public order. And therefore, I do think that in the to and fro of states that are indeed staking out positions and hoping to reach some moderate ground, that there should not be a Manichaeanism, much less ad hominem attacks, on people who feel that it's their professional role to make propositions that are maximalist in their aspiration. So, therefore, withholding funds for reform, I think, in the past, alas, despite the ICJ's opinion in the Congo case, despite my credibility as a lawyer, has been, in fact, politically one of the few ways to get change at the UN.
I just wanted to add one thing about introspection. If by that one means dwelling on painful experience in order to extract lessons from it, which it seems to me is one of the primary purposes of introspection, this has in fact been quite alien to UN culture until extremely recently. Now, I should say it's quite alien to human nature probably as well. If you look at the UN now in terms of the Secretariat, one of the reasons I think that the peacekeeping department actually is quite a bit more effective than it used to be is that it has engaged in quite systematic and serious introspection. Other parts of the institution have not. But I should also add that there is no mechanism whatsoever for introspection on the part of the members.
Well, I think by the size of the audience, it should be an indication to you as well as to us how important this issue is. And I thank you, all three of you, for being here because you made it the special evening it was. Thank you.